The rain began some time before dawn, and did not fall in drops so much as it settled into the forest like a decision, soaking bark, darkening soil, deepening every scent in this part of Oregon, until the air itself felt heavier to breathe. And when I stepped out of the tent, the clearing looked smaller than it had the night before, the trees leaning inward as if closing ranks. After the conversation we had forced upon them, Ethan was already awake, reviewing footage beneath the shelter of the tarp we had stretched between two trunks, the glow of his monitor pale against the gray morning, while Lena stood at the edge of camp, listening through headphones to the recordings of the final 3 knocks. Her face composed but tighter than usual. None of us said much at first because there is a difference between experiencing something and replaying it. And hearing the pattern again in daylight did not make it less deliberate. If anything, it made it harder to dismiss. The 4th, softer strike at the end of the sequence lingered in the wave form like an afterthought, or perhaps a correction. And Ethan finally broke the silence by saying we should return to the basin, document everything in controlled light, take proper measurements, and then decide how far we were willing to push this. I agreed outwardly, but internally I was already aware that the word push implied force, and force had been the catalyst for everything that happened here 15 years ago. We packed efficiently and moved out without lighting a fire, the forest floor slick beneath our boots. And as we walked, I noticed how quickly nature had reclaimed the scars of logging, moss swallowing metal, saplings rising through cracked concrete foundations. And yet the memory of the cut lingered in the geometry of the land, in the unnatural spacing between trunks, in the absence where giants once stood. Daniel had written about this in his notes, describing how certain sections of forest seemed to carry a tension after being disturbed, as if something invisible resisted the intrusion long after the machines were gone. And I wondered now whether that tension was psychological projection or something more ancient. As we approached the basin again, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the circular formation clearly, fallen trunks radiating outward like ribs around a hollow center, and standing there in daylight stripped away some of the immediate fear, but replaced it with scale. The woven debris at the core, larger than I had registered the previous afternoon. Branches bent and interlocked in ways that suggested repetition over time, rather than a single event. Lena began photographing the structure from multiple angles, while Ethan measured distances between trunks, narrating observations about the orientation of breaks, pointing out that several of the fallen trees appeared to have been pushed rather than cut, their roots partially exposed, but not severed cleanly. I knelt again near the spot where we found the shell casing and scanned the surrounding ground more carefully, brushing aside damp needles until I uncovered another small fragment of brass half buried in mud. 2 casings within a few feet of each other. Not random, not scattered, but clustered. Daniel had fired at least twice, maybe more, and the implication pressed against my ribs with uncomfortable weight, because whatever stood here that night had not been a fleeting shadow. It had been close enough to justify repeated shots, close enough to create panic or urgency. Ethan called us over to the edge of the circle, where he had found a fresh break in a sapling. The wood split inward again, fibers compressed rather than torn outward, and at roughly 8 feet above ground, the bark bore a faint indentation, shaped like pressure rather than claw. Lena raised her camera to capture scale, while Ethan stretched his arm upward to demonstrate the height. Falling short by nearly a foot, the physicality of it grounded the moment in something tangible. Not myth, not folklore, but mass and leverage. And yet the basin did not feel violent in the way a predation site does. There were no scattered bones, no fur, no obvious signs of feeding or territorial display, only structure and disruption layered over each other like the memory of a home dismantled. As we documented each detail, I became increasingly aware of the silence beyond the circle. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of birds, specifically. No distant calls, no wing beats. The ecosystem around us subdued as though something higher in the chain had claimed priority. Lena noticed it too and whispered that even insects seemed sparse here. A void in ambient life that suggested either coincidence or influence. And then, just as Ethan began discussing the possibility of returning with thermal equipment, a low vibration traveled through the ground, subtle enough that I might have mistaken it for distant thunder if the sky had not been clear. It was not a quake or a tremor in the dramatic sense, just a shift, a transfer of weight somewhere beyond the outer ring of trees. We froze instinctively, listening not just with ears but with posture. The vibration did not repeat immediately, but the knowledge that something capable of generating it was within proximity settled into the space between us. Ethan slowly rotated the camera toward the direction of the sensation, lens searching through layers of trunk and shadow. And I felt again that familiar sensation from the previous evening. Not hunted, but evaluated, as if the forest itself had eyes distributed among bark and branch. I took a step backward toward the edge of the basin, consciously breaking the boundary we had crossed earlier. And the air seemed to lighten by a fraction. Lena's recorder spiked briefly again, capturing a low-frequency rumble that did not resolve into a roar or growl, but into something closer, to breath amplified by distance. Ethan whispered that we should leave, not out of fear, but out of calculation. And I nodded, because the pattern was emerging clearly now. The 3 knocks as announcement, the single heavier strike as correction, the fresh marks along our path, and now this weight in motion that did not reveal itself visually, but made its presence known physically. As we retreated from the circle, I glanced once more at the woven center and imagined Daniel standing there, years earlier, confronted by the same evidence, forced to decide between documentation and withdrawal. And I wondered whether the first shot he fired had been the moment the boundary shifted permanently. Because as we stepped fully out of the basin and the ambient sounds of the wider forest gradually returned, I understood that this place was not random terrain marked by superstition. It was a focal point, a scar layered over something that had existed long before chainsaws, and whatever moved beyond our line of sight now was not reacting blindly. It was remembering. We did not speak until the basin was out of sight, and the density of the forest returned to something that resembled normal terrain, though normal no longer felt like an accurate word for anything in this region of Oregon. Ethan finally exhaled and said what all of us were thinking, that whatever caused that ground shift had mass, real, measurable mass, and that the absence of visible movement did not reduce the implication. Lena kept her recorder running even as we walked, scanning the low frequencies in real time as if expecting another tremor. But the forest resumed its surface-level behavior, a few distant bird calls returning cautiously, wind sliding through upper branches. The illusion of balance restored just enough to make us question what we had felt minutes earlier. Back at camp, Ethan spread printed stills from the morning's footage across a flat equipment case, enlarging frames that captured the broken sapling, the indentation at 8 feet, the partial impressions in mud, and for the first time the conversation shifted from atmosphere to analysis. He overlaid scale markers, compared stride estimations, calculated probable height ranges based on break angles, and the numbers that emerged were uncomfortable in their consistency. If the impressions represented a bipedal gait, the subject would stand well above 7 feet, possibly closer to 8, with a stride length exceeding normal human proportion without mechanical assistance. Lena added that the audio patterns suggested deliberate spacing rather than erratic contact, the interval between each knock nearly identical across recordings, and I watched them move from skepticism toward reluctant acknowledgement. Not because they believed in folklore, but because the data refused to collapse into simpler explanations. I stepped away from the equipment and walked toward the far edge of camp where a cluster of younger firs grew tightly together, their trunks thin but resilient. And there, at shoulder height along one of them, I noticed another fresh mark, not as deep as the cedar carving from the previous day, but unmistakably recent. Bark peeled back in a narrow vertical strip. Sap still wet. I called the others over, and Ethan examined it carefully, running a finger along the edge without pressing into the exposed wood. The height matched the earlier marks with unsettling precision. And what disturbed me most was not the existence of the mark, but its placement. It faced directly toward our tents, aligned almost perfectly with the center of camp. Lena whispered that it felt like positioning rather than random damage, and the word positioning lodged in my mind with weight, because it implied perspective, implied that whatever had made it had considered where we were standing when it chose that trunk. Ethan suggested we set up a secondary camera line facing into the trees rather than outward from camp, reversing the orientation of observation. And I agreed, though the idea carried an undercurrent of escalation. We mounted 2 motion-activated units at opposing angles and tested their range, careful not to disturb too much foliage in the process. As afternoon settled and a thin beam of sunlight finally pierced the canopy, illuminating particles of moisture suspended in air, and for a brief moment the forest looked almost serene, the basin incident reduced to something that might be rationalized later with enough distance. But that illusion fractured when Lena replayed a new segment from her recorder, captured while we were inside the circle earlier that morning, beneath our own footsteps and low conversation. There was a second rhythm, faint but synchronized, not matching our pace exactly yet close enough to suggest parallel movement, something adjusting position just beyond visual range, moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped. The realization rippled through the 3 of us simultaneously. Because it redefined the dynamic from isolated signs to interactive tracking, Ethan muttered that if someone was shadowing us, it required extraordinary coordination and patience. Yet no additional human footprints had been found, no snapped twigs at ground level, no cigarette butts or food wrappers, nothing that signaled another camp within miles. I felt the old memory of Daniel's last week surface again, the way he described in one email, a sensation of being mirrored, of hearing steps that were not echoes but responses. At the time, I dismissed it as sleep deprivation or heightened nerves. Now the pattern felt disturbingly familiar, and as evening approached once more, the forest seemed to anticipate the transition, shadows stretching earlier than expected, temperature dropping with sudden decisiveness. We gathered near the fire pit but did not light it immediately, choosing instead to sit in dimness and listen. Ethan's camera rested on his knee, ready but not intrusive. Lena's headphones pressed tight against her ears, scanning, waiting, and I found myself staring into the corridor of darker trunks opposite the fresh mark on the fur, replaying the low vibration from the basin in my mind, wondering how something of that scale could remain unseen unless it understood concealment better than we understood detection. The first knock did not come until full dusk. A single strike from somewhere to our right, not close enough to be within the clearing but not distant either. We held still, counting unconsciously, but there was no second strike immediately following. Instead, there was movement, subtle but undeniable, a shift of mass behind the nearest row of trees, branches flexing without wind. Ethan raised the camera slowly and zoomed toward the disturbance, the frame capturing only layered shadow and faint oscillation of leaves. Then from directly ahead, opposite the first sound, two knocks in rapid succession, completing the pattern from a different direction. Lena inhaled sharply as her recorder peaked. 3 knocks total but split across space, not sequential from one trunk, but distributed, as if triangulating our position. The strategy embedded in that rhythm chilled me more than any imagined roar could have, because it suggested coordination within a single intelligence, not random territorial marking, not blind warning, but adjustment, mapping. And as the final echo dissolved into the encroaching night, I realized that whatever occupied this forest was not merely defending a scar from 15 years ago. It was actively responding to our presence now, recalibrating the boundary in real time, and the unsettling truth settled over me with quiet certainty. We were no longer documenting remnants of a past event. We were participating in something ongoing. Night settled over the forest in Oregon with a density that felt almost deliberate, as if the darkness were not merely the absence of light, but an active presence pressing inward from every direction. And after the distributed pattern of knocks at dusk, none of us pretended this was coincidence anymore. Ethan adjusted the infrared settings on the forward-facing camera, while Lena repositioned one of the recorders closer to the fresh mark on the fir tree, the exposed sap still glistening faintly in residual twilight. We had crossed from curiosity into awareness, and awareness carried weight. I suggested we avoid lighting the fire that night, removing at least one variable from the equation. And though Ethan hesitated, pointing out the practical comfort of visibility, he agreed, perhaps sensing that illumination might feel like provocation. So we sat in near darkness, screens dimmed, equipment humming softly, listening as the forest recalibrated around us. At first, the usual nocturnal sounds returned in scattered fragments: a distant owl, the dry friction of bark shifting as temperature dropped. But beneath that surface layer there was a cadence that did not belong to insects or wind, a pacing, faint yet rhythmic, something heavy, placing weight carefully rather than carelessly. Lena's display flickered with low-frequency spikes that rose and fell in intervals too structured to dismiss. Ethan's camera remained trained on the corridor of trees where earlier movement had registered, and I found myself counting breaths to steady the rising tension in my chest, because fear would distort perception and I needed clarity more than adrenaline. Several minutes passed with no direct escalation, and the stillness grew thick enough to blur edges of thought. Then from our left came a single knock, louder than any before, close enough that the impact vibrated through the soil beneath my boots. We remained motionless, waiting for the remaining two to complete the pattern. But instead of immediate repetition, there was silence, elongated and intentional, as if the pause itself were part of the message. Ethan whispered that it sounded within 50 yards. Lena mouthed closer, and before either of us could respond, the second knock struck from directly behind our tents. Not the left flank, but the rear perimeter, sharp and resonant, the repositioning so swift it implied either extraordinary speed or pre-existing placement. My pulse hammered, but I forced myself not to turn abruptly, because sudden motion felt like surrender to panic. And then the third knock landed ahead of us again, completing the sequence in a triangle around camp, not linear, not distant, but enclosing. Lena's recorder clipped briefly under the intensity. Ethan's infrared display flickered as he adjusted focus, searching for thermal anomalies between trunks, and for a fraction of a second, a shape interrupted the uniform coolness of the forest. A vertical distortion slightly warmer than its surroundings, too large to be a deer, too upright to be bear. There and gone before the frame stabilized, Ethan swore under his breath and replayed the last few seconds. But the blur resolved into nothing conclusive, just layered shadow and digital noise. Yet the fact that the camera registered any deviation at all confirmed what our bodies already knew. Something substantial had moved within proximity. The pacing resumed then, slow, measured, circling without haste, the ground transmitting faint tremors at irregular intervals. Not a charge, not a retreat, but patrol, mapping our boundaries as we had mapped the basin earlier that day. And in that mirrored behavior lay the most unsettling truth. We were being studied with the same analytical restraint we believed we possessed. Lena leaned closer to me and whispered that the intervals between impacts corresponded to repositioning arcs, not random wandering. As if whatever stood beyond the tree line understood perimeter control instinctively, Ethan suggested we trigger the floodlight attached to the secondary rig, just for a burst, to break the pattern. But something in me resisted the escalation, because 15 years earlier, escalation had likely been the pivot point. Daniel firing into darkness at a presence he did not yet comprehend. I shook my head, and instead stepped forward a single pace toward the center of the clearing, raising my empty hands to chest level, not theatrically, but visibly, and spoke quietly into the dark, saying we were not cutting, not hunting, not taking anything, that we would leave in the morning if that was required. The words sounded fragile against timber older than our language, but the pacing paused almost immediately after I finished, the forest holding breath in response. Seconds stretched long enough to question whether the halt was coincidence. Then from directly ahead, deeper than any previous source, came a low exhalation amplified by sighs. Not a roar, not a growl, but a sustained release of air that vibrated in my sternum. Ethan's thermal display flared again briefly at the edge of detection range, a mass partially obscured by overlapping trunks. And this time, the distortion held for a full second before slipping laterally behind thicker cover, confirming height well above average human range. Lena's recorder captured the breath clearly, its waveform dwarfing previous spikes. And then, without warning, the pacing resumed, but outward rather than inward. weight shifting away from camp in slow retreat. No crash of branches, no reckless flight, just controlled withdrawal. As if a decision had been reached, the silence that followed felt altered, not empty but reset. The boundary redefined rather than erased. Ethan lowered the camera gradually and exhaled shakily, whispering that whatever that was, it chose not to advance. Lena removed her headphones slowly, eyes wide but focused. And I felt a mixture of relief and realization settle over me, because the interaction had not escalated into violence, despite proximity. It had become a negotiation of space, the three knocks forming enclosure, the breath marking presence, the retreat signaling acknowledgement. And as the temperature dropped further, and stars struggled faintly through breaks in the canopy, I understood that we had crossed from documenting traces of the past into direct engagement with something operating under its own logic, something that remembered the basin, remembered gunfire, remembered intrusion, and tonight it had demonstrated capacity without unleashing force, the implication heavier than any attack would have been, because restraint implies choice, and choice implies intelligence. And as we remained seated in darkness, listening to the forest resume its layered nocturnal rhythm, I knew with quiet certainty that the line we were standing on was not a relic of history, but a living boundary being actively maintained. And whether we stayed or left, whether we published footage or erased it, that boundary would remain, marked not by fences or signs, but by three deliberate knocks that echoed through timber long after human noise faded.